In this video, I'll be demonstrating how to use Blender to make this image of a planet bursting into pieces. I'll be using Blender version 2.68a. Let's start by creating a new project. So from the File menu, select New, and then click on Reload Startup File. During this video, I'll be using the Cell Fracture add-on. You should make sure that you have it before starting the project. To do that, click on the File menu and select User Preferences. Then click the Add-ons tab. Make sure All is selected, and then type Cell in the search box. This is the Cell Fracture add-on. Put a check mark here to enable it. If you don't see this add-on, then you can go to blender.org to download the latest version of Blender. Now you can close the User Preferences window. If you look under the Object Tools, you should now see a Cell Fracture button. Next, delete the cube by pressing X. Now let's add a sphere, so press Shift-A and select Mesh and then UV Sphere. Next, let's set up the light source. For this, I'm going to switch to orthographic mode. I can do this by pressing 5 on the number pad. Now press 7 on the number pad to switch to top view. Then right-click on the lamp to select it. Then press G to grab the lamp and drag it over here. Then come over to the right and click on the Object Data button. Now come up here and change this from Blender Render to Cycles Render. Then make sure the points lamp is selected, and then set the size to 3. Now click on the Use Nodes button. I'm going to set the strength value to 2000. Next, let's set the approximate position of the camera. So right-click on it to select it, then drag the red arrow to move the camera to the center. Then drag the green arrow to move it closer to the sphere. Now press R to rotate and use the mouse to point the camera to the sphere. Left-click when you're done. Next, switch to right side view by pressing 3 on the number pad. Now drag the blue arrow to move the camera to the center. Then press R to rotate and point the camera at the sphere. Left-click when you're done. Now I'll zoom in to get a closer view of the sphere. Next, let's increase the resolution of the sphere by adding a subdivision surface modifier. To do that, right-click on the sphere to select it, then click on the Object Modifiers button. Then click on Add Modifier and select Subdivision Surface. Set both the View and Render values to 2, and then click on the Apply button. Now click on the Smooth button. Next, let's add a Solidify modifier. This will make the sphere hollow and give the surface of the sphere a thickness. The surface thickness will be the outer crust of the planet we're making. To do this, click on the Add Modifier button and select Solidify. Set the thickness value to 0.05. And then click on the Apply button. Next, let's set the material for the sphere. So click on the Material button, and then click the New button. For the surface type, select Mix Shader so that we can combine 2 different shaders. For the first shader, select Diffuse. Then for the second shader, select Diffuse again. Set the color of the first diffuse shader to a brown color. If you want to use the same color that I'm using, then click on the Hex button and enter 9B6F54. Set the color of the second shader to black. Now we're going to use the FAC value to control how these 2 shaders are combined. To get a good view of what we're doing, switch to Rendered View. Then press 1 on the number pad to switch to Front View. Now click on the little button on the right side of the FAC value and select Noise Texture. Now let's add some small cracks to the surface. To do that, come down to the Displacement section. Click on the Displacement button and select Voronoi Texture. Then click on this button and select Cells. Set the scale value to 20. You can see that we now have what look like small cracks on the surface. Later we're going to be fracturing the surface and these cracks will get even smaller. Now let's switch back to solid view. We need to set a second material for the sphere, so click on the plus button, and then click the New button. A little later we're going to fracture the surface of the sphere, and this material will be used for the edges in between the broken pieces. So set the surface type to diffuse. Now set the color to DB9D77. Let's also give it some texture, so click on the displacement button and select Noise Texture. Next, let's fracture the sphere. To do that, click on the Cell Fracture button that we enabled at the beginning of the video. The source limit value sets the number of pieces that the sphere will fracture into. We'll leave this value at 100. We can use all of the default settings except for the material. Set this value to Material 1 and it will use this second material for the edges of the fractured pieces. Now click the OK button. This will probably take about 30 or 40 seconds to run, so I'll briefly pause the video until it's almost done. It's just about finished now. The result is located on the next layer. You can click here to switch to the next layer. Here you can see the individual pieces that it has been broken into. The next thing that I'm going to do is to join all of these objects together so that I can work on all of them at the same time in edit mode. But you'll notice that the Join button is grayed out. So what I can do is to hold down the Shift key while I right-click one of the objects. Now I can click on the Join button. Next, press Tab to go into edit mode. Then press A once or twice until everything is selected. We're going to be using Cell Fracture again on some of these pieces a little later, so we need to remove the doubles for it to work as expected. So click the Remove Doubles button. Now click on the Smooth Vertex button and set the number of times to smooth to 2. This will not only smooth the pieces, but it will also add a gap between the pieces. Now we're going to separate these pieces back into separate objects. To do that, press P and select by Loose Parts. Now press Tab to go back into object mode. Now press A to deselect all of the objects. Then press B and draw a selection box across the center of the sphere. This will select all of the objects that it crosses. Now move these selected objects to the next layer by pressing M and then select the third layer. Now switch to the third layer by clicking here. Then click on the Cell Fracture button. Set the source limit value to 10. Then, as we did before, change this to Material 1. Now click the OK button. This will fracture each of the selected objects. And just as before, the result will be placed on the next layer. Since we'll have a fractured copy on the next layer, we will no longer need the objects on this layer, so I'll delete them as soon as this is done. So now to delete these objects, press A to select them all, then press X to delete. Now click here to switch to the next layer. I'm going to join these objects together, but just as before, the Join button is grayed out. So I'll hold down the Shift key and right-click on one of the objects. Now I can click the Join button. Next, press Tab to go into edit mode. Then press A once or twice until everything is selected. Now click on Remove Doubles. Then click on Smooth Vertex. Set the number of times to smooth to 4. Now separate the pieces back into separate objects by pressing P, and then select by Loose Parts. Now press Tab to go back into object mode. Now press A to deselect all of the objects. Then press B and draw a selection box across the center to select all of the objects that it crosses. Now we're going to move these selected objects to layer 3. If you recall, we previously deleted all of the objects from layer 3, so it's currently empty. So to move the selected objects, press M and then select layer 3. Now click down here to switch to layer 3. Next, we're going to move these objects away from the center so that they will look like they're flying away from the planet. To do that, click on the Origin button and select Origin to Geometry. Then click on this button so that we can scale the position of the objects without changing their size. Now scale by pressing S, then 1.2, then Enter. Now switch to layer 4. We're also going to move these objects away from the center, but not quite as far. So press A to select all of the objects, then click on the Origin button and select Origin to Geometry. Then scale by pressing S, then 1.1, then Enter. Now click on this button to deselect it. It's important that you do this because if you don't deselect it, then later when we try to scale and rotate objects, it will not work the way we need it to. Now is a good time to save what I've done so far. So from the File menu, I'll select Save As. I'm going to name this planet.blend. The planet's outer crust is located on layers 2, 3, and 4. To view these layers all at the same time, hold down the Shift key and click on layers 2 and 3. Now let's work on the molten hot center of the planet. So click here to switch to layer 1. We originally used this sphere as the starting point for the planet's outer crust. Now we're going to use it for the center of the planet. So we'll start by scaling it down a little. So right-click on it to select it, then press S, then 0.95, then Enter. Next, delete these two materials from the object by pressing the minus button 2 times. Then press the New button. For the surface type, select Mix Shader. Then for the first shader, select Emission. Then for the second shader, select Emission again. Set the color of the first shader to a yellow color. Then set the color of the second shader to a red color. To get a good view of what we're going to do next, switch to Rendered View. Now click on the little button on the right side of the FAC value and select Noise Texture. Then set the distortion value to 10. Now if you hold down the Shift key and click on layers 2, 3, and 4, you can see what we have so far. Now let's change the background to a black color. So click on the World button. Then click on the gray color and change it to black. Next, let's add some stars to the background. Since this is a still image, I can just add a particle system behind the planet. So to do that, switch to Solid View, then press 7 on the number pad to switch to Top View. I'll zoom out a little. Now press Shift A and select Mesh, and then Cube. Since the camera is here, we need to move the cube here so that it will be located behind the planet. Now scale the cube up in size on the x-axis by pressing S, then X, then 5, then Enter. Now press 1 on the number pad to switch to front view. Then scale the cube up in size on the Z-axis by pressing S, then Z, then 3, then Enter. Now click on the Particle button. You may need to expand this panel first to bring it into view. This is the Particle button. Now click on the plus button to add a particle system. Change the number of particles to 3000. Set the end value to 1. Since we're not going to do an animation, this will make all of the particles visible on frame 1. Now come down to the Render section. Remove the checkmark next to Emitter so that the cube itself will not be displayed in the final rendering. Now click on the Object button so that we can use an object for the particles. Now we're going to create an object that we can use. So press Shift A and select Mesh, and then Icosphere. Then move it out of the way. Next, set the material for the icosphere by clicking the Material button. Then click New. For the surface value, select Emission. Set the strength value to 0.5 so that the stars will not be too bright. Now right-click on the cube to select it, and then click on the Particle button. Now click in this entry box and select the icosphere that we just created. Then set the size to 0.01. Also set the random size value to 1 so that there will be variations in the size. Now let's see what this looks like looking through the camera. So press 0 on the number pad to switch to camera view. I'll zoom in a little. When I'm in camera view, I like to lock the camera to the view. So to do that, press N to open the Properties panel and put a check mark next to Lock Camera to View. Then press N again to close the Properties panel. Now I can zoom, pan, and rotate the view while looking through the camera. So now I'll position the view that I want to render. This is pretty close to what I want to render, so I'm just going to make a minor adjustment. Now I'll switch to rendered view to see how things are looking so far. Next, let's add more pieces of the planet's crust flying around. To do that, we'll add another particle system. So switch back to solid view. Then press Shift A and select Mesh, and then Cube. Then scale the cube up in size by pressing S, then 2, then Enter. Then scale the cube down in size on the Z-axis by pressing S, then Z, then 0.2, then Enter. Next, click on the plus button to add a particle system. Set the number of particles to 200. Set the end value to 1. Down in the render section, remove the check mark next to emitter. Then click on the group button. This time we're going to use a group of objects instead of a single object like we did before. So click on the layer 3 button so that we can view only the objects on that layer. Then press the A button once or twice until all of the objects are selected. Then press Ctrl G to group these objects together. I'm going to name this group Crust. Now hold down the Shift key and click on layers 1, 2, and 4 to bring all of the layers into view. Now press A to make sure everything is deselected, and then right-click on the cube to select it. Now click in the Group entry box and select the Crust group. Then set the size to 1, and the random size to 0.5. Now I'll switch to rendered view. Now let's rotate the camera a little. So click on the camera up here to select it. Then press R, then 20, then Enter. Next, let's add a misty fog around the planet to represent gases that are escaping. We'll start by doing a quick render. So click on the Render button. For now, keep all of the default values and click on the Render button. We're going to be using this rendered image in the next step. Now click on this button down here and switch from 3D View to Node Editor. I'm going to close this property panel to give myself more room. To do this, I just press N. Now click on the Compositing Nodes button if it's not already selected. Then add a check mark next to Use Nodes. I'm going to rearrange these a little. Next, let's add a glare filter. Click on the Add menu and select Filter, and then Glare. Drag it up here until the line beneath it turns orange. Then left-click to put it in place. Next, we're going to add the image that we previously rendered to this view so that we can see the effect that this glare filter has on it. To do that, click on the Add menu and select Output, and then Viewer. Then place the viewer to the right. Then add a connection from the glare filter output to the viewer image input. Then add a check mark next to Backdrop. Now as we change the settings of the glare filter, we'll be able to see the results. So let's change the glare filter type from Streaks to Ghost. Then set the threshold value to 0. Then set the color modulation value to 0.5. Now we're ready to render the final image, but I'm going to save the project first. It's a good idea to save the project before rendering in case something goes wrong during the rendering process. Now click on the Render button if it's not already selected. Then open the Sampling section. I'm going to set the number of render samples to 300. Then come back up here and click on the Render button. I'm going to pause the video until it's done rendering. Rendering is finished, and this is the final image. To save the image, you can click on the Image menu and select Save as Image. I'm going to name this image planet.png. Well, that concludes this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe and leave a comment.